Another example, suppose we're dealing with kids who are a little bit older. Here's an example that struck me. Did not occur in a formal schooling setting, but nonetheless, it's, I think, a perfect example, and realists would applaud this sort of thing. Some years ago, when we moved ourselves into a new subdivision, many of the houses were recently built, but there were large tracts of land that were still undeveloped. And so one of the things I noticed driving home was that there were some kids that seemed to be in the age of 10 to 14 years of age or so, and in some of the vacant lots they were riding their bikes up and down the lots, and they had bikes that were designed, I believe they're called BMX bikes, designed for jumping over ramps, and they're designed for rougher terrain. So they were making some paths for themselves through the vacant lots. And then as I was going along, I noticed over time that they were getting a little more creative about this. They'd taken some shovels over and they were building ramps for themselves and digging pits. And they had some lumber, and I'm sure they had swiped some lumber from some of the building sites, and they'd built some ramps for themselves. And all these things seemed to be pretty crudely built from what I could tell. But then the next significant development that happened that made me actually stop and investigate a little bit further was one time I'm driving home, and I noticed the dads seemed to be involved, and the pits had been dug out a little bit more. The ramps, the wooden ramps had been built. Now the construction of those was much more sophisticated, and things were organized. There were now 8 or 10 kids there and 4 or 5 dads who were involved in the scenes, and all of the kids were lined up with their bikes at one end of this fairly long way, and there was a ramp that had been built. And what the kids were doing was the kid would take off on his bike, ride as fast as he could down the path, hit the ramp, and fly through the air as far as he could, and he would land. And then one of the dads was there measuring how far the kid was able to jump. And another dad was standing there with a clipboard keeping records, and they had a table. Here's this kid, and on this first try, this is how far he jumped, right, and so forth. Even one of the dads I noticed had a gun. I believe they use these in baseball games, a speed gun where you can measure how fast a pitch is being thrown. And what this dad was doing was, as the kid on his BMX bike was hitting the ramp, he would make a notation of how fast the kid was going at that particular instance, and that was also being noted on the clipboard. Now the point is, the kids were having a blast. They were really motivated. The dads, of course, were having a blast as well. But this is in part a lesson in mathematics. It's a lesson in physics. They were measuring the angle of the ramps, and they were able to jack the ramps up and lower the ramps down to see if that made a difference. They were measuring how fast the child was going, what the kid's velocity was at the point. There was measurements going on, and the kids were motivated to beat their records and so forth. So the point here is that we have physics, we have mathematics, we have engineering. I'm sure the kids were trying to tweak the mechanics of their bicycles as much as possible to get the maximum speed out of them, and everybody was having a great deal of fun. So we have theoretical stuff, practical stuff integrated with pleasure, and I think from a realist perspective, that's a beautiful thing educationally. Now, I've mentioned this is going on outside of the formal school system, but clearly this is the sort of thing that could be integrated into a formal school system.